It's time for the Bible Geek.
We don't really know for sure what is and what is not.
Holy Ghost.
God, fantastic.
God blasting on the spot.
Ghost.
Yes, friends, it's time for the Bible Geek.
Interpretation.
Jesus, homiletical. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Bible Geek Robert M. Price here to wish you a happy Halloween and to get into some questions. But first, let me shamelessly plug my new book, Moses and Minimalism. I do have copies now, and if you want one, maybe you could send me $20 and I'll autograph the thing. And be sure to include your address, since sometimes it doesn't show up on PayPal notifications for reasons known only to people far more intelligent than I. So, what say we get into some questions? This one refers to my Zarathustra Speaks column, which this time is called October Agenda, and comments on several of the movies my daughter Victoria and I are watching in our countdown to Halloween. Okay, this is from Uncle Abaddon. It says, first, let me say thank you for your October essay. The older I get and the more horror movies I watch, the more I love the old classic monster movies. I really enjoyed your reviews and added a couple of titles to my growing collection of Halloween season favorites. I have to throw in a plug for the Secret History of Hollywood podcast. Adam Roche has a 7-hour-long audio documentary called A Universe of Horrors. It's an in-depth look at classic monster movie history, and if you've got the time, it's well worth listening to. It's easy enough to find with a simple internet search, so that's the Secret History of Hollywood and the documentary A Universe of Horrors. Okay. In the past, watching all these great horror movies has me thinking about one of my favorite genres, that of demonic possession, and I thought of a couple of questions that I'm hoping the power of Christ might compel the geek to answer. In the past, you've talked about the idea of Satan coming from Zoroastrian dualism, and I began to wonder if the idea that demons could take possession of humans came from the same place. Given that demons are supposed to be fallen angels, can we assume that unfallen angels would have the same ability, even if they chose never to use it? If not us... Wait a minute, police car just pulled up outside. I just couldn't help taking a look. By the way, if you hear some rustling, it's a couple of my cats playing with some packing paper. I know they love it, so I left it out there. I sort of hope you can't hear it, but if you can, that's what's going on. It's not static. Okay, if not something all angels can do, what is it about their rebellion from God that gives them, the demons, this unique Holy Spirit-like power? If Satan is himself just a fallen angel, then it seems like circular regression to think it's a power received from him. If demons have powers that God's angels don't possess, wouldn't it be reasonable to think they are the more powerful spiritual beings? Happy Halloween. Thank you, Unc. Let's see, I am not sure if the notion of demonic possession comes from Zoroastrianism, because, of course, a lot of cultures have demons and demon possession, which is basically a pre-scientific diagnosis, right? It's even in the New Testament, or the Gospels, very often the demons that Jesus casts out of people are sicknesses. The whole notion of possession really is crystallized in epilepsy, this fit. And why would anybody act this way? Well, they were seized upon by a demon. and that's what epilepsy means, upon seized. So I'm guessing this just grew up as a kind of pseudo-medical diagnosis, and the opposite side of it, the divine version, would be prophetic possession by the Spirit of God, which is sort of equivalent to angels, right? It's a sort of an arm of God, something that concept that tries to protect the transcendence of God by not having him hands-on involved in things that happen among us. And so this, but you do have some, well, like with Samson, the Spirit of God, or the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, seized him, whatever, and he does mighty deeds empowered by God. I don't think it is ever put in terms of either prophecy or miracles as the result of angels. Though it is possible that in the Gospels, as I translate it in the pre-Nicene New Testament, that when it says Jesus was healing, because it said the power of healing was with him, that power sometimes is used, exousia, is used sometimes as a term for a class of angels, the principalities and powers, possibly fallen angels, as in that particular use of it in the epistles, the phrase principalities and powers, like in Romans. But it seems to me that powers could well refer to angels, and that a healer had the power of the angels with him to heal, but that's pretty tenuous, I admit. I think the notion of demon possession causing illness and madness is not derived abstractly from the idea of a demon, like. It's like saying, well, Superman has these powers and is vulnerable to kryptonite. Why doesn't Captain Marvel have a similar vulnerability? It really is. It kind of comes from the other end. It's demons are supposed to be bad guys, unclean spirits, and so if you don't really know what causes epilepsy, deafness, muteness, and all these other things, you say must be Satan, must be some supernatural entity. And of course, you could say that it is God. And sometimes they did say that, right? That God has afflicted him, like the paralytic. Jesus, when he heals him, says, "My son, your sins are forgiven." He doesn't say, "be healed." And that it certainly implies that he's assuming God inflicted the poor guy with paralysis for some sins. Well, so you could be victimized by the demons, or you could be punished by God, and I'm guessing that it was a matter of your conscience as to which, the old Job problem. I seem to be afflicted, but I can't think of anything I could have done. I'd be happy to repent if I could, but I don't think I'm in bad with God. So it must be terrorism by an evil force. So I think the demons came in handy for this attempt to explain illness. So happy Halloween to you, Unc. Let's see, Alan Schulman. I'm wondering if any of the pre-Christian cults made such an effort at historicizing their divine figures as the developing Christians did. If not, could it be that Jesus is a product of the modern age? I mean by modern, the post-Hellenistic imperial Roman period, which must have been more materialistic and convinced of the power of science to keep the water flowing, etc. And so might it be necessary necessary to have a divinity that does not reside only in the celestial realm. Maybe this is the key that sets Christianity apart in terms of its wide appeal in that time period. If not, why all the great pains to prove the Gospels really happened? Did it matter to followers of Osiris or Dionysus? Well, in Plutarch's Isis and Osiris, he historicizes Osiris and Isis as a very ancient king and queen of Egypt. And Herodotus, earlier still, imagines that there was a Hercules, and he tries to fit him into a historical context or two and can't decide between them, so he gives up. But he felt that there must have been some human at the basis of this. Likewise, others must have pictured Asclepius as simply a great physician of the past, and so on. This was such a widespread theory. It was called Euhemerism, named for Euhemerus, the main proponent of the theory, who said that all gods were, as we might put it, vestiges of ancestor worship. An ancestor, immediate or remote, is still watching over you, and if to go back to the illness business, a lot of shamanic societies thought that the shaman could go into the spirit world and determine the origin of your sufferings. Is your ancestor who's watching over you afflicting you because he sees some shady business deal or adulterous affair and is punishing you, trying to, kind of a wake-up call? And so an ancestor turns into a kind of a god. This isn't quite the same thing, but it seems to me it's a similar, analogous phenomenon, that there are great people of the past who have been not literally and metaphysically made into gods, like the Romans said, right? The emperors all became gods when they died, but rather Euhemerus, and I think one of the pre-Socratic sophists also said that that it was just that there were famous ancient people who got mythologized. And that's, of course, what mainstream critical scholars say about Jesus, that there was a Jesus, but he was a more modest, realistic figure than what we read in the Gospels, and he's been pumped up by way of legendary transformation. I think that's, Plutarch could have started an Osiris seminar, and let's find out let's peel back the layers of the mythical Osiris to get back to that Egyptian king. They'd have no success in that, and I don't think the Jesus seminar does either. But there were pretty darn old attempts to historicize the gods. Now, you can go back before that and say several of these myths do presuppose that Hercules, Asclepius, and others lived on Earth as gods, incarnate avatars or something, who knows. But that idea that, had you been there, if you could get into your time machine and go back, you could have seen Hercules. So it's sort of a false opposition, I think. Okay, let's see. This is... Okay, let me scroll down and find out who wrote this, and this is kind of long, which is... Oh, I thought so. David Oliver Smith, author of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, and other stuff. Says, I continue my research and writing on Mark, and I wanted to thank you for a resource. Your article, New Testament Narrative as Old Testament Midrash, in the Encyclopedia of Midrash, Biblical Interpretation, Informative Judaism, edited by Jacob Neusner and Alan J. Avery Peck, etc. As a couple of hefty volumes there. Okay, he says, it has been an invaluable tool in my writing. I did want to correct one mistake I think I found, or maybe you can set me straight, and I want to add some further sources to your collection. Your article says at number 14 that the healing of Jairus' daughter, Mark 5:21 through 43, is based upon Elisha and the Shunammite woman's son, 2 Kings 4. I'm in total agreement with that as a general proposition. However, you cite Randall Helms for the proposition that in the Septuagint, at 2 Kings 4:31, it says the Shunammite is ecstatic with all this ecstasy. Exestes pasantain extasin tautain. However, I cannot find that phrase in any online copy of the Septuagint. It would more naturally fit at 437 after Elisha has cured the son, but I don't see it anywhere. But then I don't read Greek very well either. Helms makes the same claim in his book Gospel Fictions that you accurately cite. Did I miss something? I'll have to look that up. I got a Septuagint around here somewhere. Maybe I'll remember to mention it again next time. Additionally, I think I've found that Mark used 1 Maccabees as a source. Oh boy. It looks like Mark 11:2 through 10, where Jesus is entering Jerusalem on a donkey, is based on 1 Maccabees 13:51, talking about Simon Maccabeus. And entered into it the 23 day of the 2nd month in the 171st year, with thanksgiving, and branches of palm trees, and with harps and cymbals, and with viols and hymns and songs, because there was destroyed a great enemy out of Israel. Could be. Also, Mark 11:15-19, when Jesus clears the temple, he might have used 1 Maccabees 13:47 through 50 as a source, in addition to Isaiah and Jeremiah. Quote, "So Simon was appeased toward them, and fought no more against them, but put them out of the city, and cleansed the houses wherein the idols were, and so entered into it with songs and thanksgiving. Yea, he put all uncleanness out of it, and placed such men there as would keep the law, and made it stronger than it was before, and built therein a dwelling place for himself. They also of the tower in Jerusalem were kept so straight They also of the tower in Jerusalem were kept so straight that they could neither come forth, nor go into nor go into the country, nor buy nor sell. Wherefore they were in great distress for want of victuals, and a great number of them perished through famine. Then cried they to Simon, beseeching him to be at one with them, which thing he granted them, and when he had put them out from thence, he cleansed the tower from pollutions. Interesting. The cleansing of the temple. Yeah. Entered into it. Yeah, because in general, you could say this reflects the temple purifications of Josiah and Hezekiah, but the fact of this entering into it, yeah, that is interesting, very interesting. Then when the elders questioned Jesus' authority at Mark 11, 7 through 33, the source could be 1 Maccabees 10, 6 through 7. Wherefore he gave him authority to gather together an host, and to provide weapons that he might aid him in battle. He commanded also that the hostages that were in the tower should be delivered him. Then came Jonathan to Jerusalem, and read the letters in the audience of all the people, and of them that were in the tower. Let's see. Questioning the authority. Let's see. I'm not quite sure I see the parallel there. I have to think about it. And finally, Jesus' trial before Pilate and the abuse of Jesus by the Roman soldiers after his conviction could have been taken from 1 Maccabees 10:59 through 66. Now King Alexander had written unto Jonathan that he should come and meet him. who thereupon went honorably to Ptolemais, where he met the two kings and gave them and their friends silver and gold and many presents, including action figures and DVDs, and found favor in their sight. At that time, certain pestilent fellows of Israel, men of a wicked life, assembled themselves against him to accuse him, but the king would not hear them. Yea, more than that, the king commanded to take off his garments and clothe them in purple. And they did so. And he made him sit by himself, and said unto his princes, Go with him into the midst of the city, and make proclamation, that no man complain against him of any matter, and that no man trouble him for any manner of cause. Now when his accusers saw that he was honored according to the proclamation, and clothed in purple, they fled all away. So the king honored him, and wrote him among his chief friends, wrote him on the list of them, right? And made him a duke and partaker of his dominion. Afterward Jonathan returned to Jerusalem with peace and gladness. They all accuse him. He's clothed in purple. Interesting. So Mark has Jesus doing the same things Simon Maccabees did, but being treated the opposite from Jonathan Maccabees. I found that Mark almost invariably cites to a source twice. Here we have 2 citations of 1 Maccabees 10 and 2 citations of 1 Maccabees 13. When I started this email, I only had 1 citation to 1 Maccabees 10, and I thought there must be another one. So I went back to 1 Maccabees 10, and sure enough, I found the one about Jonathan being granted authority. Very interesting. Eager to see the book that this is probably going into, Dave. Keep up the good work, and be sure to save some time in December for a trip over here so we can all go to Pizza Village. Tradition. Let's see. Merlin Barry from Swan Quarter, North Carolina. What in the world does Mark 9:49 through 50 mean? What with salt and fire and all that? Everyone shall have salt in yourselves, and so on. For everyone will be salted with fire. Well, here's one of those places where I think C.C. Torrey had it right in his book, The Gospels from Aramaic, when he says this seems to be a kind of a mistranslation of an underlying Aramaic phrase that says that everything that's in danger of spoiling is salted, namely to preserve it. So it's sort of telling you what the salt metaphor implies. You can stop things from going bad with the salt, which in turn kind of has redolence of covenant as well as preservation. So I think that's the most likely thing. If it doesn't mean that, the only thing I can figure, and this is the way I put it in the pre-Nicene New Testament, that it's talking about sinners being devoured by Molech in his subterranean realm after death, where he's going to eat them and perhaps salts them as he's cooking them up. I admit that's kind of far-fetched, but you gotta find it's like when you're looking for something you've lost, and you look every place that sounds likely to you. It's not there, and you then say, well, it's got to be someplace. I guess I'll look at the places I wouldn't expect to have lost it, and then bingo, you might find it. This is sort of what you got to do with some of these utterly weird passages. There's got to be some kind of weird explanation. You got a mystery, and so it's going to take a crack in this code to get it. But I tend to go with Torrey on that. Everything liable to be spoiled is salted. Another question from Alexander, the PhD student in Ohio. I've been reading Frank Zindler's The Jesus the Jews Never Knew, a fascinating book, by the way, and in it he points out that Philo of Alexandria's description of the sect known as the Therapeutai makes them look exceedingly like proto-Christians. However, Zindler argues that because Philo lived his adult life in the first part of the 1st century CE or AD and wrote during the supposed lifetime of Jesus, there's no way that the Therapeutai were Christians in the sense that we think of the word today. That is, people who read read the gospel and based their religious practice on it. Zindler takes the Therapeutai to be evidence that, quote, Christianity, unquote, was already in development during Philo's lifetime, and that Jesus was likely a later addition to a pre-existing branch of Jewish mystery religion. What is your view of all this? I find that quite plausible, and Frank would never claim to be the first to make this theory. There were people who were followers of the Dutch radical critical school, like J. Gordon Rylance and others, who observed that we hear about various Alexandrian Jewish groups who had views about the Logos and the Son of Man and so forth, very similar to Philo, and that Christianity began in Alexandria among these more mystical Jews who were influenced by by Greek philosophy and Hellenistic religion, and some of whom thought Jews need not keep the law because the law was allegorical and we can tell you what it meant. Philo argued against them. Oh, no, you're right, it's certainly allegorical down to the bone, but you still got to keep them. This kind of is reminiscent of the Pauline debates. If you understand what the law was pointing to, you don't need to keep it anymore. Well, and Eusebius thought that Philo's Therapeutai were Christians. He even thought Philo met Simon Peter, and so forth. So it's Epiphanius lists a sect, a pre-Christian sect called the Gesseans, which seems to be a reference to the Essenes. And it's quite likely that mystery religion Judaism gave birth to Christianity, or was at least one of the major roots of it. So I think Frank's hypothesis there is well founded and well argued, though inevitably speculative, right? We have only a few stones, and we're trying to reconstruct the larger mosaic. I know that's what anthropologists do with fragments of skulls and so on, but it remains somewhat speculative, and yet it's a strong speculation. It's just that in the nature of the case, you can't dogmatize about this stuff. Oh, well, we've shown that, like, I would never say we've proven that Jesus didn't exist. No, I think it most likely that he didn't, but that's not saying we've discovered it, we've proved it, we know it. Let's not go that far. That's where we pass over into the conspiracy theory eccentric character that some attribute to us mythicists. Let's not do that, right? And the same would apply to any critical scholar on the historical Jesus. You can pursue a certain paradigm and think that it makes a lot of sense of a lot of evidence, and so you say, well, that's where I'm taking my stand tentatively. But of course, all such scholars continue to participate in the scholarly dialogue and are open to revision. You have to be. Hey, another question from your friendly educational technologian, Dennis Lecker. In the not-so-recent past, I had a Facebook discussion with Reuven pertaining to the thread of the needle appearing in each of the synoptic Gospels. The answer to my question from Reuven regarded the manner in which to address the passage. He argued that you had previously stated that one ought to simply interpret the text for what it is, that is, a literal thread and a literal needle. And of course, that's a metaphor, right? But that is the nature of the illustration or whatever it is. However, I've not heard you say anything about the issue in the Human Bible, and Bible Geek podcasts all raise the topic again. Some personal history of this debate. During the time I was an active member of the Navigators and Campus Crusade, I had many discussions with a female whose family was quite wealthy. She interpreted the passage to connote that of a camel passing through a gate located in the Russian church in the old city of Jerusalem. However, the so-called gate had not been constructed until the 16th century, so I ruled out such a reading. Let me just comment there. I'm probably getting ahead of the game. Of course, the point of that was, as the camel has to get down on its knees to get through this inexplicably small gate. I mean, it's like a little flip door, dog or cat entrance to your house, right? Why would there be such a thing, and why would you take camels through there? But it's a pious way of saying, yes, if you kneel and unburden yourself, you can get into the kingdom of heaven. The fact that this gate dates from the 16th century, that isn't fatal to the theory, because you could say that this is just an attempt to tag some definite site and say, well, this is the one he was talking about, which is no different really from saying, here's the site of the crucifixion. Yeah, that's the ticket, and I'll show it to you for $5. This is the empty tomb. Yeah, that's what it is. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't one. It's just that you got a fraudulent, or like, hey, how'd you like to buy a piece of wood from the true cross, and there's so many of them. It would be a cross big enough to crucify King Kong, and that doesn't mean there wasn't an actual cross. That's a whole different matter. So it could be this is just a late attempt to single it out like all false relics. But the big problem is, this whole tradition first appears in the writings of the monk Theophylact in, I think, the 13th century, which is still pretty late. Nobody ever mentions it before that, and it does seem not only an unnecessary hypothesis, but an ad hoc hypothesis, an attempt to get out of an unpleasant reading, like how many rich Christians are there that needed to squeeze permission for being rich or staying rich out of the Gospels? Well, maybe not many, but churches who need wealthy donors might promote such a understanding of the passage in order to smooth their feathers and get them to cough up some sacred bucks. Let's see. In a similar regard, before I began typing this question, I asked my Catholic father as to his interpretation, and lo and behold, he too responded that the eye of a needle was a gate through which a camel could not pass without stripping off everything but the essentials. Thus, my questions are, A, how did the gate interpretation manage to become the common understanding of the passage? Well, to sum it up with a saying from the church lady, how convenient! Right, you just got to repent. Don't worry about actually divesting yourself. B, how does the geek interpret the passage? It just means that it's impossible to get into the kingdom of heaven if you're wealthy. This assumption that all wealth represents theft, the kind of Occupy Wall Street primitive socialism. Please don't write me complaining about that. That's my opinion. I don't really need to be preached at about how it's wrong. I think it's right, but at any rate, that's the idea. Oh, nobody would be wealthy. Income inequality. Nobody would be poor if somebody wasn't wealthy and taking their fair share. This just shows a total failure to grasp economic reality. maintains the ancient limited good fallacy, which may have been true at one time. When you couldn't create wealth, you could only grab as much of it as you could, but that's changed as of capitalism, but a lot of folks still don't see it. And the idea is, I thought you were going to ask if about the rope is the thread, like what's his name, George Lamsa points out that in Aramaic the word Camel could be translated legitimately either as camel or as cable. The similarity of the words is pure coincidence, but that he's trying to say you couldn't get a big, thick rope through the eye of a needle. Well, that would still be making the same point. You can't do it, so a rich man cannot get into the kingdom of heaven. I know the passage goes on to somehow mitigate that, where the disciples say, what? If even God's favorites, the rich, they assumed, can't get into heaven, who can? And Jesus says, with men this is impossible, but not with God. I think that's an add-on to change it. With men it is impossible, but not with God. You have that in Luke's nativity. It's a general religious statement. What men can't do, God can do, so have faith. He'll do it, right? I think it's tacked on here to say, well, okay, theoretically the rich couldn't get into heaven, but God can make it possible. I think that just that is also a rationalization. It just seems to uproot the previous saying and negate it rather than interpret it. See, might Matthew, Mark, and Luke have all agreed that to be wealthy was to be destined to an eternity of weeping and gnashing of teeth? Yeah, I think so. Though it's not that simple. That wasn't the only view of wealth in the early church. Right, because there was, I take a look sometime in my book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, at the chapter on the Mahayana and Hinayana Gospels. There's a distinction that I think is pretty pronounced among the sayings that gets papered over by the compilation of the gospel materials. Somebody didn't quite understand the relationship and the contrast between these two types of preaching. I think the Roman Catholics did understand it a bit later. There are these counsels of perfection. These, if you would be perfect, sell everything you own, give to the poor, come and follow me. There's no hint that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, who were wealthy, were going to hell for it. The sayings, given to everyone who asks of you and lend without expecting to be repaid, that assumes that you're very generous with money you have. It doesn't assume that, like the ancient cynics, you just dumped everything and lived without property. And so there are passages that do say that, right? If you don't give up all that you have, you can't be my disciples. They must have been addressed to different audiences, not necessarily by Jesus, but among early Christians. Who knows? Could have been Jesus, could have been early Christians, that you were looking for a few good men, as the recruitment slogan has it, to become itinerant prophets and evangelists, like Paul was, or you were talking to householders. You didn't expect them to give up everything, but they should be generous to those who did, right? Anyone who gives, one who bears the name of Christ a cup of cold water, well, he'll get the same reward, right? That right there shows the difference. So I think there's an interesting book called Hostility to Wealth in the Synoptic Gospels. I can see it, but I can't see the author, but I'm sure that's the title, Hostility to Wealth in the Synoptic Gospels. I think you'd enjoy that book. Let's see, Lachlan Cristante, Vampire Predator. This sounds like a snarky atheist question, but I'm serious here. In Genesis 5:18 through 21, how did Abraham arrange the animals? All right, let's what's going on there? This is one of the covenant foundation passages. Let's take a fast look at it. Boy, thin pages, hard to turn. Wait a minute. Genesis 5? I think you got the wrong one. Maybe you're thinking of Genesis 15. I think you are, but it might as well be the same since I can't seem to turn the darn pages. Good God. Okay, I think I got it. One more page, come on. Man, all right. Here we are. 7, was it? Oh, 18 through... Well, this is what I think you're referring to, but the citation's not right. Abe isn't even introduced until chapter 11, right? Or chapter 12, whatever. In 15:7, and he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord Yahweh, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a she-goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought him all these, cut them in two, and laid each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and lo, a dread and great darkness fell upon him. Then Yahweh said to Abram, Know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. And this is like a redactional addition, just telling you what's going to happen eventually in the book. But the story resumes in verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. I kind of think of Close Encounters there. On that day Yahweh made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kryptonites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Oh boy, that's a lot of ites. Looking at parallel translations, it looks like there's not even a consensus as to whether he split the mammals and reconnected them, or if he split the animals and laid them opposite each other. I had the impression of the latter due to reading the New International Version. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. If I remember correctly, upon reading this, I had the impression of an octagon where he lay in a circle of corpses, the dove and pigeon making a pair. That's got to be right. My fiancé had the idea of a column of mammals with the dove and pigeon at his head and feet, not necessarily in that order. It strikes me that if I take myself out of my 21st century... Is it the 21st century already? Oh, sorry. If I take myself out of my 21st century worldview where animal sacrifice is utterly repudiated and place myself into the zeitgeist of a Bronze Age magician priest, perhaps there is a formula, a correct way of doing this magic that would have been recognizable. Maybe something from Sumerian divinatory practices? It's a morbid question, and one that almost certainly had no consensus, but any resources you could point me to would be fascinating. Well, Lachlan, I have always figured it as being two columns as well, and this seems to reflect the ancient ceremony of cutting a covenant, which is what they called it. We say making a covenant, but the idea was, from what I read, that in ancient covenant making or treaty making, you would bisect the animals and lay them out like this, and the two parties to the covenant would walk through the middle of the aisle between the animal halves, and which is why the flame and all that goes through them. That represents God passing through in the midst of the pieces. And the notion was that the same thing, or may the same thing happen to us if either of us fails to live up to the covenant, the deal we've just made. It's similar to when Saul raises an all-Israel army by cutting up oxen and sending the parts out to tribal leaders, saying, as Israel is scattered, there was no king yet, let's, like these pieces, let's bring them back together to avenge the people of Ramoth Gilead, or whatever it was, with the possible implication that if you don't, this is going to happen to you. There's, I think it isn't necessarily religious, though everything was back then, and they probably did figure it was God who would avenge anybody that failed the covenant. Similar to when Jacob and Laban make a covenant, reluctantly, grudgingly, and they say, may Yahweh watch over you and me as we part. That isn't the happy trails to you kind of blessing one understands or misunderstands when you see this on a Hallmark card or something, right? It means, hey, look, God's going to see you. Don't welch on this thing. So, you know, it's the same sort of thing, invoking the doom for anyone who fails to live up to it. That's what I think, anyhow. Yeah, all right. Thanks, Vampire Predator. This was a question. Wait a minute, let's see. Let me see here. Ooh, boy. This is a long thing. It's going to take a while to get to it. Let me, well, maybe I'll do another quick one and get back to this the next time. Oh boy, this is a long one too. Ooh, boy, we got several mini treatises here. Okay, here's a quick one. Ken Sponberg says, you mentioned in an article that Joseph Smith was willing to die for his made-up religion, but wasn't he killed trying to escape out the window from assassins? So is this a bad example? Just curious. I don't think it is, because he was jailed by a Mormon faction who didn't like his introduction of polygamy into the movement. And I believe, I could have this mixed up a bit, but they had destroyed a printing press where he was printing up some kind of propaganda in behalf of this. And he was jailed for this, and then lynched by Mormons, dissident Mormons. And he was in the jailhouse at Nauvoo, and naturally he's trying to escape. But the fact that he, well, you know, what is that? I think also of Michael Servetus, or Miguel Servetus, who was burned at the stake at Calvin's order. He was begging for mercy and crying as they dragged him to the stake, but I don't know if you can blame a guy for that, right? It's not, he's not going resolute and imperturbable, but He was put to death for his theological views, and I guess he could have recanted. And it seems to me that you'd have to say that Smith died for his faith. He could have, I think he did make it up, basically, but by that time he probably had convinced himself it was true. And it seems to me we really don't have any solid evidence about the death of early Christian martyrs. We don't know if they were given the opportunity to recant or if they tried to, but it was too late. I mean, we know some of them were given a last minute, "That was your last chance, buddy," and they didn't. But sometimes they may simply have arrested Christians, hearing that they were Christians, and killed them. It's hard to say, but I think it's certainly a guy who's convictions got him into trouble, and he died because of them. I don't think we can say he necessarily said, wait a minute, everybody, I was just kidding. I don't think we hear that, and that could have happened, but who knows? That might qualify it a bit, Ken, but I still have to consider him a martyr to his faith. Let's see. This is one from Chuck Quino from Fairbanks, Alaska. We know of texts and artifacts dating back to within a few decades of Christ's supposed death, which we're led to believe marks the 0 hour of the current dating system. It has been 2,015 years since he was either born or crucified. I'm not sure which. If, as you sometimes mention, Christ may not have lived at all, what happened at year 0? When was the CE system adopted, and how do we know? Oh boy, I forget. It was sometime in the Middle Ages. I'm thinking the 14th century. I could be wrong, though. Dionysius Exiguus was the monk that came up with this, and let's see. Let me see if I can find this real quick. Dionysius is, of course, the basis for Dennis. Dennis is another version of it. He lived between he was born about 470 and died about 544. 6th century monk born in Scythia Minor. He's the guy that came up with it. I was only about 1,000 years wrong there. What he meant to do was to have the birth of Jesus be 1 AD, and he didn't take into account the statements about Jesus being born while Herod was still alive, Herod the Great, and that's what screwed it up, and why people say now that Jesus must have been born between 4 and 6 BC or BCE. And so it is the birth, not the death, though I know why you're saying that, right? Because we were all told as kids that BC meant before Christ, which is true, and that AD meant after death. Well, what the heck is in the middle? The Twilight Zone or something? Well, no, it doesn't mean after death. It's for the Latin phrase Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord, which means since he's been on earth, right, from his birth onward. So what did happen in that year? Nothing much. I mean, for these 5 centuries afterward, even Christians used the Roman dating system, years since the founding of the city of Rome. So this was done in retrospect, and it was done by hints in the Gospels, trying to figure out what year it must have been, because after all, Luke does give a synchronism, as they call it, that Jesus was baptized about the age of 30, and that this was when Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene, and Herod Antipas was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, and Caesar Augustus was emperor, and Annas and Caiaphas held the pontificate and all that. And so since these people are mentioned in Josephus and I guess elsewhere, you can figure out about when Luke must have thought Jesus was born. So it's not like there was some big like Burton Mack would say, some big bang at that point. But it must have been something else than Jesus if there wasn't a Jesus. No, it wasn't that. It's reverse engineering a date from the gospel data, which may be fictive, right? Now, what you're bringing up, that does apply to the supposed birth of Zoroaster. That's a case where something happened, but we're not sure which, because the most commonly offered date for the birth of Zoroaster in the 6th century BC that may be a confusion on the part of the Zoroastrian scribes living centuries after the event, a confusion between that and the ascension of Cyrus to the throne of Persia. They knew something big had happened, and they were confused as to which one it was, right? So that what you say, that can happen, but it doesn't seem to have happened in the case of the Gospels and Jesus. There's similar huge debates about when Prince Siddhartha, Gautama Buddha, was supposedly born. These things are, and all this kind of uncertainty, and there's disparate views in early Christianity and in Judaism about when Jesus was put to death. Was it 100 years before the New Testament says? Was it in the reign of Claudius, when Jesus would have been about 50? It's not an open and shut thing. And by the way, one last detail on this. The terminology has changed in certain quarters, because before Christ and in the year of our Lord obviously implies a Christian theological basis to the whole thing, right? And at some point, I guess in the 60s maybe, there were ecumenical and other scholars who thought, this is not exactly fair to our Jewish friends. I mean, living in Western society, they use the Western and Euro-American dating system just to avoid hopeless confusion, right? My birthday is going to be October 7th in 5000 so-and-so, because you're dating it from the Pentateuch's creation date and all that stuff. Right? So they use the Western dating. If you lived in Saudi Arabia, you'd be using the Muslim dating system that starts with the Hijra of Muhammad, right? So they use the numbers, but do you really want to force Jews to be speaking of the year of our Lord by calling it AD? And so, out of consideration and respect, scholars suggested, well, how about this? How about if instead of BC, before Christ, we say BCE, before the Common Era, that is, once Christianity begins, or once, beginning with the birth of Jesus, more or less, when Christianity and Judaism are on stage at the same time for the first time. Yeah, okay, before the Common Era. And then instead of AD, CE, obviously, the Common Era. I tend to use both. I'll say, well, in the 6th century BC or BCE and that kind of thing, right? So, okay, I guess that's it for today's exciting episode of the Bible Geek. Again, send me the, what was it, $20, 25? Yeah, I think it was, well, let's say $20 for Moses and Minimalism autographed. Thanks a heap. And if you can afford to make any donation, well, I guess first I would suggest you send it to Acharya S.'s fund for paying for her whopping medical bills, because she's fighting very acute cancer. So that I'd like you to remember her, but if you got any left over, maybe you could funnel some of it to the Bible Geek. But it's never a fee, right? Don't worry about that. I'll keep on geeking. So thanks for being with me again, and I'll see you soon on the Bible Geek.